that Obama's like conviction to the Afghanistan war. Yet, when the lady called in and told you that, in the end, his book, he writes that he agrees with her.
Right. And, Randy, we found that part and read it for you. We'll have to leave it there. The House is now in session. Live coverage here on C-SPAN.
Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., January 9th, 2014. I hereby appoint the Honorable Luke Messer to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 7, 2014, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member, other than the majority and minority leaders and minority whip, limited to 5 minutes. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And this Saturday, on January 11th, people throughout our country here, people throughout the world, will be observing Human Trafficking Awareness Day. The start of this new year, I think, is a fitting time to focus on the shameful fact that human slavery is not a relic of ancient history, that in fact it's with us today. It's a brutal reality, a reality faced by more than 20 million victims around the world, many of them trafficked for labor, but increasingly for underage girls, for young women. This is a case where they are exploited in this trafficking as well. Even in my work as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I've learned that human trafficking is no longer just a problem over there. It is a problem in our communities here. It is a problem in developing economies, but also it's a problem in the United States and in Europe. It's a scourge even in the communities that we serve here and that we represent. In my own community in the last 2 years, the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force has assisted 250 victims. 93% were women, most of them underage, 80 of them from foreign countries. At our November field hearing in Fullerton, the Orange County District Attorney testified that shockingly, when we're speaking now about trafficking, sexual trafficking, shockingly, the average age of a child being trafficked in this country is 12 years of age. A little girl who has not even reached her teens. We also heard from one brave survivor, Angela Guanzon, who was trafficked from the Philippines into forced labor in Long Beach, California. I've heard many other stories from the members of the Human Trafficking Congressional Advisory Committee that I established last year in my Los Angeles County District Office. The Forum for communicating on trafficking between law enforcement, advocates, service organizations, and survivors has contributed profoundly to my own knowledge, my own understanding of this issue, and I encourage my colleagues to get to know those on the front lines of the fight against human trafficking, get to know them in their districts and know of their work, and you're going to be informed, challenged, and inspired by what you learn. This January, designated as National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month, is a perfect time to shine a spotlight on the dark issue of trafficking. But awareness is only a first step. More needs to be done. And to that end, I would urge my colleagues to join me in co-sponsoring H.R. 3344, the Fraudulent Overseas Recruitment and Trafficking Elimination Act, to combat one critical form of reoccurring abuse, and namely that is unscrupulous recruiters. By targeting the recruiters, we can do a lot. These recruiters who bait foreigners to travel to the United States with promises of good jobs, but trap them in sexual exploitation or forced labor once they arrive. For example, in my home county, the Salvation Army's network of Emergency Trafficking Services reports that a full one-third of their clients, 33% of their clients, were recruited in a foreign country by a labor recruiter. They got here and found it was a very different job than the one they enlisted for. This represents not only an assault on the dignity of the victim, but also a subversion of United States labor laws and our non-immigrant visa system. And in response, this legislation requires that prospective foreign workers be given accurate information about the terms of employment and be given anti-trafficking protections against U.S. laws. It prohibits recruitment fees or hidden charges used as coercive leverage against workers. In other words, once you get here to the United States, you can't find out afterwards because they didn't disclose to you that there are fees that you owe. Those fees are no longer allowed. Up front, the employer pays those fees. Requires foreign labor recruiters to register and remain in good standing with the Department of Labor, and it provides new incentives and enforcement mechanisms to ensure that recruiters and employers follow these disclosure and registration requirements. Members may contact the Foreign Affairs Committee to join this important anti-traffic initiative. I encourage you all to sign on to my legislation. And as people of goodwill around the world observe Human Trafficking Awareness Day this weekend, let us move beyond mere awareness. Let us abolish this injustice and protect and restore the dignity of those who have survived such exploitation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our interim agreement with Iran gives us an opportunity to unwind seemingly intractable interrelated conflicts throughout the Middle East. There is no reason for Congress to complicate by further enhancing sanctions now that are already working. We have this 6-month to a year window to fashion a longer-term agreement. The fact that we are even talking with Iran is the most encouraging signal that we've seen in 34 years. Let's use this diplomatic window. There are hardliners in both countries, highly suspicious, very negative, who would like to blow this agreement up. Unless we're willing to invade and occupy Iran, even repeated bombing will delay the Iranian nuclear effort at best 4 or 5 years, maybe less. Americans have spent $1 trillion, lost 4,000 American lives, with tens of thousands of wounded in more than a decade in Iraq, and it's still falling apart. Iran is bigger, stronger, and more sophisticated. I don't think you can sell that war to the American people. Congress should calm down and give diplomacy a chance. Let's learn about this important country, its 4,000-year history, and our past mistakes with Iran, and most important, our common interests. The Middle East has long been a simmering cauldron, with the conflict suppressed by a lid of repression held down by empire and colonial powers. That started to change a century ago with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and colonial powers trying from afar to influence human behavior by drawing lines on maps from European capitals irrespective of religion, tribal, and ethnic realities. It set in motion a series of forces that are playing out today with tragic consequences. Iran, as the dominant Shia force in the region, could play a huge role where we share common interests, in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, for instance. The current situation is a result of partnerships between Congress and the Obama administration that got us to this point where Iran is willing to negotiate. Strong, effective sanctions would never have worked without careful, artful diplomacy that involved other countries like India to help us squeeze Iran. It has worked. Let's claim credit and move on to the next steps. We could start by trying to learn about each other. Let's promote an exchange between Iran and the United States with students, religious leaders, maybe even parliamentary members and members of Congress. Let's focus on our shared interests, like Afghanistan, where we had earlier cooperation with Iran to help overthrow the Taliban. Let's work to make progress with the agreement and beyond. And the Congress can do this most importantly by leaving it alone. Congress shouldn't meddle. Congress shouldn't muddle. Congress shouldn't give Iranian hardliners who don't want any agreement at all an excuse to scuttle it. We have an opportunity to improve the most volatile region in the world, and Congress shouldn't blow that opportunity.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker for his recognition and good morning to my colleagues. Thank you. 48 hours, million-plus Americans received letters in their mailboxes. They weren't overdue tax letters. They were not letters suggesting that you are at fault. It was not a notice to say that you're no longer an American citizen. And it was not a letter to say you're now relieved of any responsibility to pay any bills or to provide for your family. It was a letter denying or extinguishing, taking away the unemployment insurance that most Americans have come to understand that as working Americans, having worked in their life, that they would be the recipient of these benefits during a brief lapse or a extended lapse of not being able to find work. The chronically unemployed percentage is the highest that it has been in decades. And therefore, this is not the time to delay. I hold in my hand as well the resume of a competent worker, college graduate, has a responsibility to support his family, and who has been looking for work for 2 years, earnestly, energetically, intently and intensely, and cannot find work. The clock is ticking on the 30 hours in the United States Senate. But the real concern is my friends in this body, recognizing that these letters deal with people's lives, and to make a representation that all is well, unemployment generally is 7%. However, it was lower than that when President Bush signed the unemployment insurance benefits in 2008. And these guys, these distinguished Americans, misfits, why can't they find work? 20,000 plus are veterans looking for work, men and women who served in the United States military, or, as we met in the White House on Tuesday, a mother of 2 distinguished men who are serving in Afghanistan. So the 1.3 million languish while we are trying to make a determination that may not be able to be made. Frankly, I would ask that we all be reasonable. I would simply make the point that it is an emergency. I want to pause for a moment and thank the Houston Apartment Association that has worked with me and has sent a letter to all of their members asking for those 12,000, some of whom are residents of apartments in Harris County, to be sensitive and tolerant of those individuals who can document that they were the beneficiaries of or the recipients of unemployment insurance that was cut off on December 28th. And I want to applaud them for their sensitivity in dealing with those particular individuals. I asked mortgage companies and utility companies and city water bills companies to be tolerant as well, to be working with families who are basically without a lifeline. But the issue before us is the fact that these letters have gone to people as this lady who has looked every day liked her job, laid off for no fault of her own. But right now we have the opportunity to pass an emergency relief. Some of us have introduced bills for 1 year, but a 3-month emergency relief, and then contemplate, discuss, and work with what might be the appropriate way of funding the continuation. No person, unemployed, chronically or not, is happy with an unemployment benefit check. What they're happy with, Mr. Speaker, is the ability to work and to provide for their families. So I'd make the argument that as we discuss privacy issues on the Affordable Care Act, which are already taken care of by CMS, today, the floor, and tomorrow we should be passing unemployment insurance. I ask my colleagues to join me on both sides of the aisle, recognizing that Americans want to work. Let's help them transition with a bridge of an unemployment insurance. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Ross-Layton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last November, the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, came to meet with my colleagues and me who serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And in that meeting, Ambassador Power told us that despite U.S. law that prohibits any funding to UNESCO because of its decision to admit a non-existent state of Palestine to its membership, the administration was going to make it a priority to seek waiver authority to continue U.S. taxpayer funding to UNESCO. And now, indeed, this is coming to fruition. There is a congressional push by some to grant the administration this waiver or to seek other ways to get around this prohibition. I'm here today to voice my unconditional and unyielding opposition to this push, and I urge my colleagues to join me to remove that in the budget that will be before us soon, to not allow the administration to yet again circumvent U.S. law and to throw away hundreds of millions of dollars of the U.S. taxpayer money. The administration is seeking to not only restore $80 million in taxpayer funds to UNESCO for this fiscal year, but it is also seeking to pay nearly $250 million more in arrears, dues that we owed to UNESCO, an agency that has an anti-U.S. and an anti-Israel agenda. If we restore funding to UNESCO, we are tactically agreeing with their support for Abbas, the PA, the PLO, the non-existent state of Palestine, and the UN scheme to undermine the peace process by granting de facto recognition to a Palestinian state without it first coming to an agreement with Israel to resolve this long conflict. A vote to restore any U.S. funding to UNESCO or to give the administration any waiver authority to circumvent the existing law that prohibits, again, prohibits U.S. funding to UNESCO would not only undermine our credibility and set a dangerous precedent, but it would further embolden an already intransigent Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority. Why do I say intransigent? Because even as we sit here, Mr. Speaker, reports indicate that a major holdup in the peace negotiations between Secretary Kerry, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority is the refusal by Abbas and the PA to recognize Israel as the Jewish state of Israel. Is that the kind of member that we want to be associated with in UNESCO? One that doesn't even recognize the identity of another state, and not just another state, our closest ally. I know that UNESCO is riddled with rogue regimes amongst its ranks, including the likes of Cuba, where the callous, brutal, murderous Castro regime has been repressing the rights of 11 million Cubans for over half a century, and Syria, where the tyrant Assad has caused the deaths of over 130,000 people and brought the Middle East to the very brink. But if we restore U.S. funding to UNESCO, we are essentially saying that, hey, it's okay. And, oh, by the way, why not add one more in Abbas? There has been a recent spate of terrorist activity against Israel, and rather than act like a true leader should, who seeks peace and a partner in a negotiated peace settlement, Abbas was definitely silent when it came to denounce these acts of terror. But the powers that be at UNESCO don't seem to mind this at all. But not us, Mr. Speaker. We are better than that. We aren't about to trade in our credibility and our principles as a country for this platitude and for this circumvention. We know that if we concede to UNESCO, if we restore any funding, we would be making a grave mistake and also wasting hundreds of millions of dollars of our constituent dollars on this anti-U.S. agenda. I will continue to fight this push to restore funding to UNESCO in any way, and I will continue to rally my colleagues to join me in this fight. Thank you very much for the time, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, study after study has shown us that investment in quality early education leads to better educational outcomes, stronger job earnings, and lower crime rates. Decades of research confirm that quality preschool helps prevent achievement gaps for low-income children with long-term benefits for our nation. But we don't need research to confirm the importance of quality early childhood education. Ask any parent in America if it matters to them. The problem is that not enough children have access to it. That's why I've introduced the bipartisan bill, the Strong Start for America's Children Act. When Congressman Hanna, Senator Harkin, and I introduced the bill in November, we were joined by a sheriff of Minneapolis, a top private sector CEO, a retired Air Force general, a parent, and Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan. These leaders from so many segments of our country understand the need for greater federal investment in high-quality preschool. My legislation proposes an innovative federal-state partnership to increase resources to local school districts and community-based programs that provide quality pre-kindergarten for 4-year-olds. It also allows funding for educating 3-year-olds, and it allows states to spend some of the money on good quality infant and toddler care. The bill improves child care quality for infants and toddlers by supporting partnerships between child care and early Head Start. Millions of young children from low-income families lack access to high-quality preschool programs and child care services. They're on waiting lists because of limited public funding. This deepens the achievement gaps and impedes the nation's economic and workforce successes. For example, Early Head Start has shown to be an effective, high-quality program, yet the sad truth is that only 3% of the eligible children have access to it. Additionally, 1 in 6 low-income families are eligible for federal child care services has access. Mr. Speaker, this is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. Babies and toddlers and preschoolers don't know that political parties exist. In fact, we're seeing that Republican and Democratic governors from all regions of the country are pushing for more funding in this early learning in their states. They want to be partners with the federal government. State legislators from both parties, a wide range of states, have led efforts to support quality preschool. Just recently, we received a letter signed by more than 500 state legislators from both parties in support of this issue. I'm also very proud of our partnership with the fellow Republican members of the House, such as Mr. Hanna and Mr. Grimm. We all know that the policy makes sense for America's future. We know that what is possible for our communities and in our nation if kids are given a fair shot at success. The public understands and believes in early childhood education. The bipartisan poll released in July found an overwhelming majority of Americans support quality early childhood education and rated a national priority, second only to increasing jobs and economic growth. 7 in 10 Americans support the federal plan to help states and local communities provide better early childhood education. Members of Congress and other policymakers are also getting on board. The bipartisan budget agreement reached last month includes a reserve fund for early childhood education, child care, and voluntary home visitation. That's yet another acknowledgement by another bipartisan group of members, in this case budget leaders, that early childhood education should be a top priority for the federal government. That acknowledgement is clearly a step forward, but it isn't enough. Our next step is the enactment of the Strong Start Act. When fiscal year 14 spending deadline is less than a week away, I understand that the appropriators of both houses are considering increased funding for preschool, as outlined in our bipartisan bill. I heartily encourage that course. Despite the language used whenever we are in Congress to talk about budgets, funding early childhood education isn't spending. It's an investment, and it's an investment that's critical for our nation's long-term economic strength. From a better educated workforce to a reduced need for social services, study after study has documented the enormous return on investment of early childhood education. We can save between $7 and $12 for every dollar invested. These are real savings resulting in less grade repetition, lower special education placements, lower dropout rates, less spending on welfare and social services, more tax revenue, and lower incarceration rates. As Sheriff Richard Stank said when he launched the Strong Start for America's Children's Act, "I'm the guy you pay later." Let's stop spending on the back end what we should be investing in the beginning in the child's life. For all of these reasons, our bill has the support of more than 60 national organizations representing pediatricians, law enforcement, religious groups, labor unions, business and military leaders, people with disabilities, school principals, civil rights leaders, and literacy advocates. Now is the time to empower the next generation and guarantee a better future for our nation. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Ridgell, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege for me to be here this morning and to share with you and our colleagues the story of an exceptional American, Ron Miller, who I'm proud to say lives in Virginia's 2nd Congressional District, the district that I have the privilege to serve and to represent. Ron is 46 years old. He's right here, and he'd always planned to go back to school, but at age 33, his life was rocked. He was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, a devastating neurodegenerative disease that progressively affects nerves in the brain and the spinal cord, and it's a disease for which at present there is no cure. Now, Ron is paralyzed from the nose down, yet he used eye-glazed technology, computer technology, to complete his associate's degree in liberal arts with honors in a bold and courageous effort to bring attention to ALS. The wonderful staff at the Lake Taylor Transitional Facility where Ron lives and where the graduation ceremony took place were there, and I saw tears coming down several of the staff members' eyes as they watched Ron receive his degree. And actually, the president of Excelsior College made the effort to fly down to be with us that day. I was deeply honored to be there and to have the privilege of sharing the commencement address, but it certainly wasn't my words that inspired everyone who was there. It was Ron's words that he shared through his computer. He didn't talk about himself. He didn't talk about how difficult things are for him. He mainly thanked all of those in his life that had made the degree possible. He talked about the importance of education and the importance of finding a cure for ALS. I want to share just a small portion of what he shared that day. I watched his eyes as they guided the cursor on the screen to the play button. When he hit it with his eyes there, it actually started the computer to speak, and he put it this way. He said, "I ask that all of you bear with me as I stumble my way through this. At least I can blame the computer if I mispronounce anything." Well, listen, that got a laugh there. He's got a great sense of humor. He thanked another person. He said, "Thank you for ensuring that I start each class not as a disabled person, but as a differently abled person." He thanked all the nurses and the nurses' aides there. He said, "You are my heroes, and first of all, it takes a lot of work for me to look this good." So as I shared with you, he's got a great sense of humor, and he thanked his family, and he thanked his friends for their love and support. And he put it this way. He said, "It isn't always easy, speaking of life." He said, "It never is. I just have a different set of challenges than most." And he left us with this quote by John Wooden. He said, "Do not let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do." Powerful words. And to me, Mr. Speaker, Ron's courage and his remarkable achievement represents the very best of the American spirit and the human spirit. It's a strong heart that chooses to be grateful for life's simple blessings, one that values the gift of friendship, that embraces the pursuit of knowledge, and the one that does not rest in a relentless pursuit to lessen human suffering, especially for those who will follow. So I really count it as a high privilege to know Ron and to count him as a friend. He's fulfilling his mission to ensure that Americans are educated about the challenges that those with ALS face. And he's also shown us what a person with ALS can accomplish. He and many others who are heavily burdened with ALS and their families are calling attention to the need for improved access. And we have a wonderful facility in Virginia Beach that is just a tremendous asset for those who are afflicted with a disease that affects their physical mobility, and that includes many of our wounded warriors. It's J.T. Grommet Island. It's right there on Virginia Beach, really the first on the East Coast that allows people that are mobility impaired to get down and experience the joy of being on the water and the sun and the sand and just being outside. You know, there's a lot more work to be done, and I'm so proud of our friends Bruce Thompson and others. His son Josh is afflicted with ALS, and he led the effort to build that facility that I just mentioned there. It's called J.T. Gromit's Island, and it's named in honor of his son Josh, who's struggling with this, and his family is as well. And I just want to close my comments today with great respect for those who are struggling with this disease and to share with you something that Ron has said about his struggle, and it's an outlook on life that I found profound and inspirational. And I posted it in my home to where I see it every day. He said this: "I may have ALS, but ALS does not have me." So, Mr. Speaker, may Ron's remarkable achievement and the spirit that he exhibits in his life inspire all of us to join him in this worthy fight to find a cure for ALS. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Spear, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm here to speak about unemployment insurance and the extension of it to my Republican colleagues. But there's no one over here to listen. So maybe they'll listen to some renowned Republicans talk about what's really important. How about Newt Gingrich, who recently said, "I think every Republican should embrace the Pope's core critique that you do not want to live on a planet with billionaires and people who do not have any food." Or how about John Feehery, a Republican strategist, who said, "What does the Republican Party actually believe in? What is its purpose? Is it just to have unbridled capitalism without any moral core?" Mr. Speaker, this 50-year war on poverty has faced setbacks under the leadership of both parties. But the GOP-led House seems to be actively engaged in a war on the war on poverty. Congress's inaction has cut off 1.3 million people from unemployment insurance after Christmas, and unless renewed, will cut benefits for another 1.9 million who are eligible in 2014. Some of my colleagues across the aisle have claimed that this is just politics, that unemployment insurance was, quote, intended to be a temporary solution to a very temporary crisis. Well, here's a news flash. We have been in this crisis since 2008. This is not temporary. This is long-term, and it's chronic. And it has been caused by the greed of billionaires of the likes that we have seen on Wall Street. This is a personal nightmare for many of the constituents of my colleagues across the aisle. Some of their constituents have written to my office because they think their representative is blind to how they are struggling. You know, Margaret Heffernan is a renowned speaker, and she talks about mindless blindness. And in many respects, that's what I think we're engaged in here, mindless blindness. So here are some of the stories of those impacted by the loss of unemployment insurance who live in districts of my Republican colleagues, because maybe they'll hear me and think about who's being hurt by playing politics. Payne Springs, Texas resident Linda Morosco shared her story with me on my congressional Facebook page. Linda was 60 years old when her legal secretary job was eliminated, with more than 40 years of work experience under her belt. This is not someone sitting on a couch at home. 40 years of experience as a paralegal secretary. She believed unemployment insurance would protect her if she lost her job. Even while caring for her 80-year-old mother with breast cancer, Linda continued to look for work but got very few interviews. Her 91-year-old father then fell ill and died, but Linda continued to look for work even while in mourning and caring for her sick mother. The few interviews Linda does get, she is surrounded by people in their 20s and 30s and thinks that her age might be keeping her from securing a job. Quote, "My unemployment ended on December 28. I have no savings, I haven't paid rent yet, or electricity, or the car payment, or the phone bill, because I don't have enough money to make those payments," she wrote to me. Well, Linda, I hope your Republican congressman reaches out to you immediately to explain to you in his own words why you shouldn't have your unemployment insurance extended after being employed for 40 years in this country. Unemployment isn't a temporary problem for Daniel Burrow of Beauregard, Alabama. Daniel just hit his 26th week of filed unemployment. He lost his job in the auto industry in 2012 while he was on medical leave. The 45-year-old has exhausted all his unemployment benefits and applied for more than 50 jobs with no luck. His wife worries how the family will afford gas for Daniel to go job hunting, or how the family will pay for necessities not covered by food stamps. In Florida, 49-year-old Jim Lazario can barely pay his bills while he raises his 17-year-old daughter on his own. His unemployment insurance will run out in February, and he wonders why Congress cannot reach a deal on extending federal emergency unemployment insurance. He's been looking for a job every day since early October and is, quote, not sitting back and waiting. I would go back to work immediately if someone offered me a job, unquote. This is more than politics for 70,000 individuals in Florida who already lost their unemployment insurance. These are just 3 stories. There are 1.3 million more that could be shared here today of people who have lost their unemployment insurance on December 28th. Yesterday was the 50th anniversary of President Johnson's announcing a war on poverty. The real question is, why are our colleagues waging a war on the war on poverty? I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Fudge, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to commemorate the 50th anniversary of President Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty. In 1964, President Johnson stood in this chamber and addressed a Congress that represented a nation where more than 25% of Americans lived in poverty. In his address, President Johnson launched an agenda that led to the creation of Medicare, Medicaid, Job Corps, Head Start, and nutrition assistance for those who struggle to put food on their table. His war and its resulting programs helped move millions out of poverty. From 1967 to 2012, the poverty rate fell from 26% to 16%, largely because of the strong safety net programs initiated by President Johnson's agenda. Yet here we are today, 50 years later, and too many Americans are still living on the outskirts of hope, because the war on poverty has now become a war on the poor. In the last year alone, Congress has agreed to indiscriminate across-the-board cuts known as sequestration in an effort to balance the budget. And the House passed a farm bill that cut SNAP by $40 billion. Sequestration hurts the very people who need help the most by greatly reducing critical funding to programs like WIC and Head Start. Congress drastically cut one of the most powerful anti-poverty programs, SNAP, better known as food stamps. That is absurd when, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, SNAP kept 4.9 million Americans out of poverty in 2012 alone, including 2.2 million children. Congress has also chosen not to extend unemployment insurance. Even though our country continues to lift itself out of the recession, many Americans still need our support. Turning our back on the 1.4 million Americans who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own is unconscionable. In an interview yesterday, I was asked to respond to a quote regarding unemployment insurance by a Republican, and this is what he said. He said, "We have to introduce the blessing of work to people who have never seen it." And let me just say, to be clear, he could not possibly have been talking about unemployment insurance because you had to have worked to even receive it. So he obviously doesn't know what unemployment insurance is. And to my colleague, I say that the American people know that they should be blessed with work, but they need meaningful work with a living wage. I will continue to be a voice for the poor and will always fight on behalf of the 46 million Americans trying to survive in households with inadequate incomes. Americans need us to open the gates of opportunity so they can eat properly, get a quality education, and find good-paying jobs. So on this 50th anniversary, I am making it clear that the war on poverty might be over, but the fight for the poor is not. We must reinforce the plans of President Johnson that would ensure all Americans can support themselves and their families and have better chances to contribute to our economy and our society. This is the way we build upon the progress we have made over the past 5 decades, not by taking action to reverse it. To paraphrase Dr. King, he says, we have an obligation to those who have been left out of the sunlight of opportunity. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month was a big one for North Carolina football. You probably are well aware of the exploits of Cam Newton and the Carolina Panthers, but having clinched the playoff berth. But it was actually in my district of the 10th District in North Carolina, in western North Carolina, that was really the epicenter of football for North Carolina in the month of December. First, there was Crest High School in Cleveland County, representing the Boiling Springs and Shelby area. Crest is a perennial powerhouse in North Carolina football, high school football. And this year's Charger team was under the guidance of Coach Mark Barnes. They rode a 14-game winning streak on their way to winning the North Carolina High School Athletic Association 3AA West title. While they were upset in the state championship game, it was another very impressive season for Coach Barnes and his great team. While the Crest defeat was disappointing, all was not lost for Cleveland County, as another traditional power, Shelby High School, also played for a state championship. The Golden Lions went 12-4 this year and capped the season with a 29-7 victory to win the North Carolina 2A Western Football Championship. State Championship. Coach Lance Ware and his team continued the proud tradition at Shelby as this marked the school's 12th state championship. Pretty incredible, considering my high school has had a hard time just getting 1 or 2. Finally, the football success in North Carolina 10 continued in Catawba County, where Lenoir-Rhyne University, their football team enjoyed their best season in school history. The Bears, coached by Mike Houston, won a school record 13 games on their way to earning a spot in the NCAA Division II championship game in Florence, Alabama. While they lost the championship game, this year's Bears team finished the season ranked 2nd in the nation and provided a thrilling ride for the Lenoir-Rhyne campus and Hickory as a whole. Both the faculty and alumni were very excited, and they had a great rally before that game. And it actually brought Lenoir-Rhyne onto the national stage for some attention as well. It's a great university. So I want to congratulate Crest, Shelby, and Lenoir-Rhyne on their great successes this last football season. Now it's up to Cam and Luke to keep it going for North Carolina football, and hopefully the Panthers will win. Go Panthers.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
As our nation marks the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty this week, I rise to urge the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives to immediately extend unemployment assistance to the long-term unemployed workers who continue to struggle to find jobs as our economy recovers from one of the worst economic crises in its history. The declaration of the war on poverty was a historic moment in our nation's history when we affirmed our national priority to support those in need. The war on poverty helped reaffirm that our government has a responsibility to protect our citizens, especially during times of economic hardship. Providing support and economic opportunity creates a stronger citizenry and a stronger country. In contrast, the expiration of the emergency unemployment program last month undermines the economic security of our citizens and of our nation. The expiration of the emergency unemployment program cut off more than 1.3 million Americans from unemployment insurance, with approximately 72,000 additional Americans losing benefits each week during the first half of 2014. In my home state of Illinois, where the unemployment rate remains high at 9.2%, an estimated 82,000 Illinoisans lost benefits on December 28th, with 38,000 of those citizens living in Cook County alone. An additional 89,100, or roughly 3,000 Illinoisans a week, will exhaust regular benefits without access to emergency benefits in just the first half of 2014. Failing to help these citizens is an unacceptable failure of leadership. Failure to continue emergency unemployment benefits is not a theoretical issue for millions of Americans. It is a daily nightmare. These Americans lost their jobs through no fault of their own. They tirelessly try to find work when the jobs are few and far between, and they struggle to cover basic food, housing, and transportation costs for their families on an average of $290 a week, a pittance which typically replaces only half of the average family's expenditures. Failing to help these citizens is an unacceptable failure. Failure to continue emergency unemployment benefits poses a realistic threat to our fragile economic recovery, costing over 200,000 much-needed jobs and restricting economic growth. The expiration drained over $400 million from state economies. In Illinois alone, the loss of an average $313 in the weekly benefit means a negative impact of $25 million for our citizens. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said that the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it is whether we provide enough for those who have little. Congress must act quickly to support our citizens and our economic recovery by continuing emergency unemployment benefits. The time to do it is now, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Messer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased today to rise to honor the life of a great Hoosier, one of Indiana's finest public servants, Representative Andy Jacobs. I didn't know Andy as well as some of my other Hoosier colleagues, but I met him several times during his 3 decades representing Indiana in Congress, and I certainly knew Andy by his stellar reputation. What impressed me most about him on those occasions that we met was the humbleness with which he approached his job and the respect and civility he showed for his constituents and his colleagues, regardless of their party affiliation or political ideology. Andy never took himself too seriously. He drove a beat-up Oldsmobile and dressed like an average guy, which he was. Yet this humble and decent man was a fierce advocate for civil rights and senior citizens and built a remarkable record of public service on behalf of his constituents. That's why he was held in such unusually high regard by Republicans and Democrats alike. Andy exemplified all that was right about being a public servant. He could disagree without being disagreeable. He believed you could lift people up without tearing people down. And despite his many years representing his constituents in Congress, he refused to become jaded and allow what's wrong with politics to stop him from doing what's right. Representative Andy Jacobs never forgot where he came from and personified what being Hoosier is all about. He was a good man and led a great life that left a remarkable legacy. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I salute our colleague for those eloquent remarks. Mr. Speaker, the famed English poet Alfred Tennyson once wrote, "Hope smiles from the threshold of the year to come." Indeed, let's hope that this is the spirit that greets us here in the start of the second session of the 113th Congress. Having ended last year on a high note with the passage of the bipartisan budget agreement, we should resolve to keep that momentum going in this new year. Our first order of business should be delivering on the bipartisan accord reached before the holidays. Thanks to that agreement, we, for the first time, will replace a portion of the indiscriminate cuts of sequestration with a more balanced approach. That's particularly important in communities like my own in Northern Virginia, which were disproportionately affected because of our strong ties to the federal government. Next week's anticipated appropriations package will increase federal investments in research, innovation, and transportation. That, in turn, will help unleash business investments and create jobs, which have lagged due to the sense of uncertainty fueled by the political brinkmanship here in Congress. But until those dollars produce results, we need to work together to extend the current safety net, specifically unemployment insurance and nutrition assistance, to make sure we're not leaving our friends and neighbors behind. We've made significant strides pushing down the unemployment rate to 7%, its lowest point in 5 years. We've added more than 8 million jobs in the past 4 years nationwide, but that's still 1.3 million short of the number that were there before the Great Recession. Equally important, 40% of the unemployed are long-term unemployed, 2 years or more. This structural unemployment has been devastating for those individuals and their families and their respective communities. That's why extending emergency unemployment benefits is so critically important. This is a lifeline that families rely on to keep food on the table. More than 1.3 million Americans, including 9,000 in my own home state of Virginia, and another 39,000 in the Speaker's state in Ohio, have already lost benefits because of Congress's inaction. Thousands more will see their benefits cut in the coming months. I remind my friends on the Republican side of the aisle that both unemployment insurance and nutrition assistance provide an immediate and tangible boost to our local economies. Pulling that assistance back now would be devastating in its effects and would undercut the economic momentum we've worked so hard to build these past few months. Every dollar in assistance provided to the unemployed generates $1.64 in the local economy, and similarly, every dollar provided under the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program has a multiplier effect of $1.79. These programs have helped keep generations of families out of poverty, even while income inequality is growing worse. A recent report shows that nearly half of the nation's school children now qualify for free and reduced lunches. Those children who come from low-income homes account for more than half of all the students in 17 states, mostly in Republican districts in the South and the West, I might add. A decade ago, just 4 states reported a majority of their school children eligible for free and reduced school lunches. While I and many of my colleagues remain hopeful that the House will extend these vital supports, we are disheartened to see that the very first legislative action scheduled by the House majority in this new year is a return to the cynical attack on the Affordable Care Act. Ironically, just this week, the actuaries for Medicare and Medicaid released a report showing that in the 4 years since the adoption of the Affordable Care Act, for the first time ever, national health care expenditures have grown at the slowest rate since the government began collecting that data 50 years ago. The growth for insurance premiums in particular has slowed more than 60%, which equates to real savings for real workers, real families, and for our government. I want to work with my Republican colleagues to ensure proper oversight and accountability for the Affordable Care Act, but let's hang up this tired routine of trying to chip away or outright repeal these essential benefits and protections for families. One of our Republican colleagues was quoted in the paper this week as saying, a lot of Republicans think the big bipartisan deal was the budget agreement last year. Working together in bipartisan fashion is not a limited exercise. It's what our citizens expect of us each and every day. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and friends, it is no coincidence that President Johnson declared a war on poverty within 6 months after Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech on the Mall in Washington. Whether by accident or whether by design, Dr. King and President Johnson worked in tandem with each other. And they had something in common. They were both intelligent in their own right. But intelligence without courage can be intelligence wasted. They both understood the politics of their time. But understanding the politics of your time without courage can be an understanding wasted. It was courage that made the difference in the lives of people for decades after they each did what they had to do. And I thank God that Dr. King and President Johnson acted in tandem and that they both had courage. The marchers on Washington had 10 demands. Number 8 on that list of 10 demands was a demand to raise the wage to an amount that people could make a living off of, $2 an hour. That $2 an hour, adjusted for inflation today, would be $13.39, more than $13 an hour. Mr. Speaker and friends, it's time to raise the wage. A UC Berkeley Labor Center report in 2013 connoted, denoted, and showed that families working in the fast food industry are subsidized to the tune of about $7 billion. It's time to raise the wage. That same report showed that 63% of all families receiving subsidies had a working member. It's time to raise the wage. Corporate welfare, corporations paying poverty wages are indirectly subsidized with tax dollars when tax dollars provide food stamps, SNAP, provide Medicaid, and other assistance to workers. Indirect corporate subsidies will diminish and tax dollars will be saved when we raise the wage. Do you lack trickle-down economics? If so, you ought to want to raise the wage. Because by raising the wage, we can assure that the earned trickle will get down to the worker that's earned it. It's time to raise the wage. You think people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps? Then raise the wage, and people will be able to pull themselves up out of poverty with their economic bootstraps. Can we afford to raise the wage? Mr. Speaker and friends, yes, we can. On February 13th of 2013, the Washington Post reported that the United States has one of the lowest minimum wages among developed countries, even though we're among the richest countries in the world. 1 out of every 60 persons is a millionaire. 1 out of every 11 households is worth $1 million. And according to the AFL-CIO, CEO pay has gone from $42 for every $1 a worker made in 1982 to $354 for every dollar a worker made in 2012. It's time to raise the wage. According to Forbes, the top 25 CEOs of hedge funds, the top 25 earners at hedge funds, earn more than all 500 of the top CEOs in the Fortune 500 combined. It's time to raise the wage. In 2007, one CEO made $3 billion. $3 billion is $400 a second. It will take a minimum wage worker working full-time 198,000 years. Some things bear repeating. It will take a minimum wage worker 198,000 years to make what that CEO made in 1 year. It's time to raise the wage. If we can pay CEOs $400 a second, we can raise the wage. If we can pay corporate CEOs 354 times what workers are making, we can raise the wage to $13 an hour. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Young, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A fellow Hoosier, fellow Marine, and fellow patriot died on December